Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax.
I learned a secret about the Bermuda Triangle, but I wish I hadn't. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with the ocean. My mom hated it. She used to tell me all the time, if God intended for us to know about the ocean, He wouldn't have put so many obstacles between us and the bottom of it. I thought that was a bit reductionist, but when I insisted on studying biological oceanography and ocean engineering, she was as supportive as she could possibly be. College was the best time in my life. I loved my studies. My mom and I even bonded over it, as she let me tell her all about what I was learning about the ocean. Even though she didn't love the field I chose, she still pitched in for my education and encouraged me to live at home until I was done. She was my biggest supporter. 2 weeks after I graduated college, my dad died, and with his death, my mom seemed to lose all her will to live. She tried to hold on for me, but every day I could see the light slipping from her eyes a little more. She died the day after my interview for my dream job, and to this day, I'm convinced she did that on purpose. She knew her time was coming, and she waited so I wouldn't miss my interview. My friends always tell me that's a little morbid, but when I light candles for my mom's spirit, I can feel her there with me, and I know it's true. Anyway, I got the call with the job offer a few days after her funeral, another small blessing that I knew came from her. And despite wanting to just lay down and give up on everything, I accepted the job. I was still heartbroken about losing both of my parents within a few months of each other. But the job was everything I had dreamed and more. After a few years, I was given the opportunity to join a team that was researching previously unexplored parts of the ocean. I got assigned to the coolest place ever, the Bermuda Triangle. I know. We all grew up hearing stories about the Bermuda Triangle, and most of them can be explained by science and weather patterns. But the stories that can't be explained by science, unfortunately, I can offer you an explanation for. Turns out my mom was right. Sometimes obstacles are there for a reason. The first few weeks of our research expedition were exciting. We had a place we were staying in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, but since that's still a good 640 miles from our research site, we also had a fairly nice boat we were staying on, and the team got funds for a submarine. I won't bore you with all the scientific details of our expedition, but after about 2 months, we were granted permission to send 4 people into the Bermuda Triangle in a submarine. Our team lead decided she would select 3 people to go with her, and out of our 11-person team, we knew there would be a lot of disappointed people. She said she would give us her decision individually to avoid the awkwardness for everyone who wasn't selected. I was a bundle of nerves for the whole week it took her to decide, but on a bright, beautiful Sunday morning, Marnie found me in my bunk and told me I had been selected. To be honest, a part of me knew deep down that I was going to be picked. There was no way all of these things would have lined up so perfectly just for me to be left behind while someone else went on the submarine trip. As it turns out, we would all be better off if someone else had been selected. 3 days later, we were ready to take the submarine down to the ocean floor. The people in our group were myself, Marnie, an older man named Jacob, a guy about my age named Evan, and the 90-person crew running the submarine. We all had our hopes for what we would discover, but I think everyone was just elated to be a part of something so big. After a couple days of collecting samples and specimens, Jacob and I made a huge discovery. Caught between a rock and the ocean floor was a scuba suit in a design neither of us had ever seen before. Our suits, top-of-the-line equipment, not currently available to the public, looked a lot like space suits. This one looked like a toddler had tried to copy what we were wearing, but lacked the ability to really do it justice. The hands looked like mittens, almost exactly the way a small child would think to draw them. The helmet was oddly oblong and looked like a large bucket with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. The eye and mouth holes were covered with glass, and the top of the helmet was rounded instead of flat like a bucket would be, giving it an odd, misshapen appearance. The body was misshapen as well, with a barrel-like torso and uneven arms and legs. While I couldn't tell what the helmet was made from, it was clear that the body seemed to be made out of leather. The helmet and body almost seemed suctioned or glued together. There was no zipper, no buttons, no way I could see to dismantle it in order to put it on. More importantly, it was clear the suit was very old, but it showed none of the signs of damage that something like that should have after sitting at the bottom of the ocean for so long. Jacob and I glanced at each other, then rushed toward the strange sight as if we were both thinking the same thing. We worked together to move the rock off it, then cleared the debris that had gathered around the suit, mostly fish bones and small carcasses. We did so in complete silence, but despite the lack of words, I knew we were both beyond excited. Whatever this was, we were on the cusp of an incredible discovery. We freed the strange-looking diver's suit and carried it back to the submarine. An hour later, Jacob and I stood with the rest of the crew. Everyone hovered around the table we had placed it on. We had debated for a while if we thought it would hold up, bringing it out of the water and into a strange atmosphere, and Marnie logically decided we needed to resurface as quickly as possible so we could get the suit to a temperature and moisture-controlled storage facility. She told the submarine captain, and he said he would prepare us to resurface first thing on the following day. In the meantime, Marnie told us to work our asses off to get as much done as possible before departure. She told us that if the submarine went back down, she would probably give other people on the team the opportunity to be on the crew. That was disappointing, but I agreed it was only fair. We put the suit in the storage room we had reserved for samples, locked the door, and went back to work. That night was when the first unusual thing occurred. Around 1 a.m, I woke up to piercing shrieks and raced out of my bunk into the hallway. One of the crew members, Rodriguez I think, was kneeling on the floor, clutching his head and screaming. The captain knelt next to him, trying to talk over the sound of his screams, but all we could hear was Rodriguez repeating over and over, "The eyes, it's eyes." Nobody knew what that meant, but his fear was both palpable and contagious. The captain assured us that sometimes people struggle with being underwater for very long, and Rodriguez would get the best medical and psychiatric care possible once we got back to the surface. He insisted we all go back to bed, and everyone complied, slinking off to our bunks like a bunch of chastised children. The first thing I did in the morning was go back to the captain and ask if Rodriguez was okay. The captain smiled in greeting and assured me that Rodriguez was a bit sick, but they were sure he would be just fine. I thanked him, and as I was leaving, I heard him call out, "If God wanted us to explore the ocean, we would have gills." It was my mom's favorite joke. Every time I talked about new advances in oceanic technology, she would say that to me with a smile and a pat on the arm. I turned around and stared at the captain. I said, "What was that?" He was already facing away from me and glanced back over his shoulder. "Sorry, what?" I knew my face was tight, my voice reflecting my nerves. "What did you say?" As I was walking away, you said something about exploring the ocean. He gave me a concerned look. "Are you okay, Dr. Williams?" I didn't say anything. I nodded, every muscle in my body feeling like a tense rubber band. Yes, I'm fine, thank you." I guess I was just lost in my thoughts. As I walked out, he muttered, "Can't have another crazy on my ship." I made my way back to the sample room, which was once again unlocked, and joined Marnie, where she stood next to the area we had reserved just for the diving suit. Marnie had sent Evan out after Jacob, and I came back to chip some pieces off the rock that had pinned the diving suit to the ocean floor. And he had also collected some bits of detritus around the area as well, like fish bones and other carcasses. I walked over and said, "Have you had a chance to crack the suit open?" Marnie smirked, knowing I was messing around, and said, "Right, because I want to be the ocean version of the guy who destroyed the city of Troy." "No, but there's the craziest thing." I lifted an eyebrow, and Marnie went on, "I don't think there's a body in here." I looked over at the diving suit and felt a strange pang of fear shoot through me. How did it get down there then? Marnie shrugged. unbothered. Maybe it dropped off a boat or something. We might never get an answer to that, but we can do some testing on it to see when it was made and what it's made from. I scooted away from the wetsuit and entered the room feeling claustrophobic now. Have you had a chance to run any tests, or are you waiting until we resurface? Marnie started to answer when the door opened and a sheepish-looking crew member walked in. He said, "Doctors, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have some bad news. We aren't going to be able to resurface today after all. We're experiencing serious technical issues." Marnie and I both looked at each other, mirroring the panic on each other's faces. And in her best stern voice, she said, "Define serious issues." The crew member glanced over his shoulder, as if he was waiting for someone to step in and take over for him. Then he replied, "I'll let you have that conversation with the captain. All he told me to pass along was that we're experiencing some strange weather that's interfering with the radar, and he doesn't feel safe resurfacing until it passes. He can lower us back to the ocean floor so you can continue your research, though." Marnie sighed and passed a hand over her face, looking weary. "Yes, tell him that would be good, and please update us at your earliest convenience." She stressed the word earliest with a look on her face that always made lab assistants duck their heads and promise to do whatever she asked. The crew member was no different, and he turned to flee quickly. Before he could escape, I said, "Wait, what about Rodriguez? Is he going to be okay?" The crew member went pale and said, We don't know, Captain Cameron says." He stopped and squared his shoulders back. "He'll be fine. We'll get back to the surface as soon as we're able, and in the meantime, he's fine in med bay." I let him run out then, and turned to Marnie, who had already turned her own attention back to the samples. Before I could ask her thoughts on what was happening, she started giving me instructions, and I ran over to help her with the tests. If we had to be stuck underwater, we might as well be productive. While the equipment we had on the sub was good, it wasn't the equipment we needed to safely test the material of the suit, so we focused on analyzing the other specimens we took from the site instead. As we worked, I felt like the suit was a third person in the room, watching and judging silently as we worked. Jacob and Evan joined us at some point, and the four of us made plans for how we would use our time until the sub could resurface. Marnie was mostly frustrated that we didn't have a timeline. She wanted to map out as much time as possible, but hesitated to do that if she didn't know how much time we had. Jacob and I encouraged her to schedule our days as if we were going to be staying for the full 5 days we would have had left, and promised to do all her top priority items first. With that settled, we went to the mess hall for dinner. When we got there, I noticed that there seemed to be fewer people than usual. Rodriguez was missing, obviously, but I also noticed one of the female crew members I had started bonding with was gone too. I grabbed my food and sat down across from someone I had seen talking with her before. I smiled and said, "Hi, I'm Mara Williams, one of the researchers. Do you know where Claire Mason is?" The crew member, I thought his name was Reynolds, gave me a weird look, then shook his head, stood, and left his half-eaten tray of food where it was. I watched Reynolds walk away, feeling equal parts confused and irritated. A few minutes later, Marnie walked over and grabbed my arm. In a harsh whisper, she said, "You need to come with me." I stepped out into the hallway, feeling anxiety wringing my stomach like a dish rag. Marnie didn't say anything, but we walked down the hall until we reached sick bay. Once we got there, Captain Cameron stepped out with a concerned look on his face. I had last spoken with him that morning, and in that time, it was as if he had aged 20 years. He waited for us to step inside, then shut the door and said in a hushed voice, "Thank you both for coming. I'm sorry to be treating this so clandestine, but I have some concerns. I think you'll understand." He took a deep breath before continuing. "We seem to be having a problem with psychosis on board. You both saw what happened with Rodriguez. In the last 24 hours, we've had 2 more crew members experience the same thing. That may not sound like a lot, but when you're on a machine like this one, you need every person to be in the best health possible." He stepped aside, and we saw Rodriguez, Claire, and another crew member I thought was named Anderson, all laying in their beds. They were asleep. They seemed peaceful. Cameron continued, They're sedated. Every time they wake up, they start screaming again, and we want to keep this quiet from as many people as possible. I told the crew we believe there's a bout of mono going around, and to be cautious and stay out of sick bay. It's not a good solution, but it's what we have right now. I need you two to see if you can figure out what's going on. Marnie lifted an eyebrow and put one hand on her hip. We're not equipped for that, Captain. Neither of us have a degree in medicine or psychology. Don't you have a doctor on board? Captain Cameron gave her a look that I can only describe as pure desperation. Our medic isn't equipped for this either, and we don't have a psychologist for this expedition because it was supposed to be a short one. Please just do blood tests, something. Work with our medic and use any of his equipment that you need to. Figure out what's going on. Captain Cameron left, and I turned to Marnie and said, "This all started the night after we found the diving suit. Do you think we brought some kind of bacteria into the ship that's making people sick?" Marnie winced. "Shit, I hope not, but maybe we did. I'll go take a sample from it to see if there's anything weird. You go finish your dinner." She started to leave, then stopped. "And Mara, do not speak a word of this to anyone. We want to keep this quiet." I sulked back to the mess hall, feeling like my trip of a lifetime was slowly blossoming into a nightmare. I finished my food, then went back to sick bay to check in with Marnie. She wasn't there, and the medic was back, but he hadn't seen her either. Concerned now, I went back to the storage room. Sitting on the floor in the corner of the room was Marnie, tears flooding her cheeks, her eyes looking hollow and glassy. I ran to her side. "Marnie? Marnie? Are you okay? What's going on?" She didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there like a shell of a person. I ran from the room to the sick bay and told the medic what was going on, then went to the control room to look for the captain. When I told him what happened to Marnie and what our suspicions were, his face grew hard. He said, "Lock the room you've got that thing in and don't let anyone touch it. If one more person gets sick, I'm making you and your team get rid of it. And I'll make you bleach the entire storage room to make sure no one else gets sick." I apologized for all the trouble, agreed to his conditions, and left to update Evan and Jacob. I know Marnie told me not to, but with her out of commission, I needed as much support from the rest of our team as possible. When I got to the men's bunk area, Evan and Jacob were both there looking tense. They motioned me inside and we huddled together on Jacob's bed. Jacob leaned in and whispered, "About 20 minutes after you and Marnie left, we heard more screaming. Rugen this time. He was in the hallway near the storage room, clutching his eyes, and..." Jacob hesitated as if he wasn't sure how to explain it. He was begging for forgiveness. I don't know what about or to whom, but he kept saying, "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry," over and over. Evan took in a shaky breath and said, "We tried to help, but the person you were sitting with before Marnie grabbed you, I think his name is Reynolds. He pushed us away and told us not to say anything." My mind reeled. It seemed like something about the suit really was making people sick. Maybe Rugen had gone into the storage room for some reason. Or maybe, an even worse thought, the bacteria on the suit that was causing this had migrated from the storage room somehow. An image popped into my head of invisible bacteria crawling along the floor, lit by a blacklight showing it moving in waves towards new victims. I looked up at my two teammates and said, "Cameron, Marnie, and I think the diving suit we found might have something to do with all this. Like maybe there's some kind of bacteria on it causing all this. And with Marnie in sickbay now too, I think we may be right." We all stared at each other for a long time before Jacob said, "This is bad." Evan and I nodded our agreement. Then Evan asked, "Well, now what do we do? We can't get rid of the suit. Who knows what kind of discoveries we can make with it?" And he cast his face down. "And this discovery could put all of our names on the map, you know? We could be something." Jacob put a fatherly hand on Evan's arm. "Safety is far more important, Evan. Don't sacrifice lives to have your name on a plaque in some museum." He turned back to me and said, "I think we need to put the diving suit back in the ocean, Mara. Some things weren't meant to be found." I looked back and forth between Evan and Jacob, feeling the weight of being the tiebreaker resting on me like an anchor. Finally, I made the worst mistake of my life. I said, I think we should try to stop whatever this is before we put the diving suit back. We came all this way, and I think it's what Marnie would want. I could tell Jacob wanted to argue with me more, but when I mentioned Marnie, he closed his mouth and lowered his eyes. We agreed to meet in the storage room in an hour to try and find a way to keep the suit quarantined so no one else would get sick. The running theory was that some kind of bacteria was causing encephalitis, swelling in the brain, that was causing hallucinations and catatonia. We didn't have the right tools on board to properly diagnose them, but it was a good place to start. The three of us split up to look for supplies that might help. Evan left to look for cleaning supplies. I went to medbay to get masks and gloves, and Jacob simply said he had an idea and ran off on his own. We had agreed to meet up outside the men's quarters again, which were thankfully on the other side of the building from the storage room. A little after 9, I rejoined Jacob in the hallway. When he saw me, he sighed and said, "I knew it. I have a bad feeling." I lifted an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He gestured around us vaguely. "Evan isn't here. I haven't seen him since we parted ways, and finding cleaning supplies shouldn't have taken very long." I shook my head and handed him the gloves and mask. "Throw these on and let's go check." Jacob sighed again. "I had hoped to stay away from that area until we can deal with this, but all right, let's go." We walked to the storage room together, and when we got there, Jacob pulled me gently away from the door so he could enter first. When we walked in, neither of us were surprised to see Evan laying on the floor, hands over his head, sobbing. Jacob and I walked over and dragged Evan to his feet and carried him to sick bay. When we got there, we found a horrible sight. Somehow, in the last hour, 10 more crew members had gotten sick. We had started with a smaller crew, around 90 crew members, 30 people per shift, 3 shifts if I remembered correctly. Since we were a smaller sub, we didn't need as many people. We were now down 15 people, including Marnie and Evan. We were quickly turning into a skeleton crew, and while I didn't know very much about submarines, I had a feeling that was really bad. After we dropped Evan off, Jacob and I went to find Captain Cameron. We opened the sick bay door, and before I could process what I was seeing, Jacob had pushed me to the floor and slammed the door shut. Walking down the hallway was the diving suit. It slumped and lurched as though only one part of it at a time was able to hold itself up. We watched through the port window in the door as a crew member came around the corner and ran into the diving suit. The man smirked as though he thought someone was playing a prank on him and looked into the eyes of the mask. His face fell, his eyes widened, and he began sobbing. "I tried. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to let her drown. I was only a kid." He continued to sob, curling up into a ball on the floor as the diving suit continued to move. Jacob pulled me away from the window and placed his back to the door, blocking the port. We stared at each other in silence for a long time before he said, "Okay, this is bad and hard to believe." I nodded, feeling panic wrapping its cold, clammy hands around my throat. "What's happening? Is someone in the suit?" Jacob took slow, steady breaths, and I did my best to copy him. After a few minutes, he said, "I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think we can explain this." He turned and looked out the window again and took a deep breath. "We need to get back to the men's bunk. I grabbed our wet suits, and I think we'll need them." I was able to manage a small smile. Jacob was a good person to have on my team. We made our way out of the medbay, both of us shielding our eyes with our hands to avoid looking directly at the eyes of the suit. As much as I wanted to believe there was some logical answer, it seemed like people were having breakdowns only after looking in its eyes. We moved slowly, taking small, careful steps as we walked down the hallway. We could hear more screams echoing around the ship. They seemed to be coming from the other side of the ship, which was good, but it wouldn't be hard for the creature to catch up with us. We finally got to the bunk room, and Jacob threw the door open, both of us barreling inside quickly, and we collapsed to the floor in a relieved heap. Jacob was breathing heavily, his face red, and I was worried he might have a heart attack. I found a bottle of water and passed it to him, then waited for him to recover. Finally, his breathing steadied, and he nodded to me gratefully, then pointed across the room to where 3 diving suits sat on his bunk. I rushed forward and carried his over first, then grabbed my own and put it on. Once we were both fully suited up, I turned to Jacob and asked, "What now?" He gave me a stern look and said, "We have to get that thing off this ship. It's too risky to try and contain it." I felt the words like a deep blow and hung my head with shame. "You're right. I'm sorry." Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and gave me a tight smile. "We'll make this right. Don't worry about it too much." We both put our helmets on and stepped into the hallway. Jacob carried the body of the third diving suit. I carried the helmet, and we made our way towards the control room, hoping Captain Cameron would be in there. The plan was to find Captain Cameron and get the word out around the ship that the thing could only hurt you if you looked into its eyes. We still weren't entirely sure what happened if you looked at it, but what we had seen so far was disturbing enough that neither of us wanted to try. I followed Jacob through the ship as he led us away from the screams, taking a more circuitous route to the control room as we avoided the shambling creature. When we arrived at the control room, Captain Cimarron beckoned us in with a relieved look on his face. There were 11 crew members crammed into the small control room, and once we joined them, we were officially at capacity. We handed Captain Cameron the diving suit and explained the plan. He nodded, looking grim, and said, "That's better than risking anyone else's safety. How about I lead the creature towards the exit hatch as a distraction? You two just get over there safely and wait. Novak will watch the cameras in there and release the hatch once you three and the creature are safely inside." He gave us a pitying look. "I wish I didn't have to put you two in so much danger, but I don't see another option." Jacob and I both nodded resolutely, and I said, "It was my decision to bring this thing on board. I want to do what I can to make it right." Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I was involved with that decision too, and I second this one. Let's fix our mistake." Captain Cameron nodded, slipped into his diving suit, and the three of us stepped into the hallway. Jacob pointed to the right and then at Captain Cameron and nodded, then pointed to the left and gestured for me to follow him. We made our way down the hall towards the exit hatch. It was a sealed, pressure-controlled room that we could use to come and go for specimen collections. It was also exactly big enough to hold me, Jacob, and the creature. The few crew members we passed, we warned about what was happening and told them to hide somewhere safe and keep their heads down. I was starting to get nervous about the number of people we had sedated in medbay now. I don't know exactly how many people it takes to run a submarine, but with people dropping like flies, we had to be down to the wire. It wasn't long before we could hear scraping and shuffling coming down the hallway towards us. Captain Cameron rounded the corner, walking backwards with his head down. I glanced at Jacob and realized that if the thing pursued Cameron instead of us, we would never be able to get rid of it. I stepped away from the doorway and put myself between the creature and Captain Cameron. It didn't break stride, but when Cameron shuffled off to the side, it didn't change course to pursue him. I took over, walking backwards, until I made my way into the isolation room. It shambled after me, but didn't stop when I put my back against the wall. It kept moving towards me until it had me pinned against the exit hatch. I kept my eyes down, but called out, in a shrill voice laced with panic, "Jacob, it's got me pinned." Just as I finished speaking, I felt a hard slam and glanced up just enough to see the creature reeling back before slamming its head into my helmet again. I watched in terror as a small spiderweb appeared in the glass. The creature put its hands on either side of the helmet to hold me in place, just as Jacob was able to open the hatch behind us. Water rushed in, and the creature was sucked out into the inky blackness. I had been able to get a good look at its hands before it was sucked out, and my stomach sank with dread. I was almost certain the suit was stitched from human skin. Even with that fresh panic, I was thrilled. Gravity and physics took care of the problem for us. Then a leathery hand reached back inside, wrapped itself around my ankle, and yanked me into the cold, dark ocean. Despite our depth, I could tell a storm was raging above us. The water would briefly light up with a lightning flash, revealing the tide battering everything in its path on the surface. I could only see the creature when the lightning would flash. but I could tell it was trying to get back to the submarine with me in tow. I fought and kicked, trying to get away, but the grip it had on me was inhuman, making all my struggles to get away seem meaningless. I was about ready to give up hope when I saw something come down on the creature's hand. Jacob had found a large rock and brought it down on the wrist part of the suit. It weakened the thing's grip just enough for me to get away, and I crawled backwards. In the momentary flashes of light, I could see Jacob fighting to get away, and I began searching for a rock too. I could see the spider web in my helmet growing, and I knew it wouldn't be very long before the pressure would break through and drown me. I found a medium-sized rock and fought against the water pressure to lift it. At some point, Jacob got free from the creature and helped me lift the rock, and together we carried it to where the creature was pinned by the rocks Jacob had been able to grab, struggling to free itself. We dropped the rock on its sternum as the lightning flashed, illuminating the thing's eyes, just as I looked at them. Instantly, I was transported somewhere else. It was a sunny day in November, unusually warm and bright, and I walked down a hospital hallway. I was moving slowly, even though the nurses had called to tell me to hurry. I had been scared. I knew my mom was close, and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. I think part of me had hoped that if I never got to the room, I would never have to see her die. In a sense, I was right. I didn't have to watch her die, because she had already passed when I got to the room. The nurse said if I had only been 1 minute earlier, I might have been able to say goodbye. In the memory, I sank to my knees in the doorway of my mom's room and began weeping. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned around, expecting to see a doctor, but instead I found myself looking right into the face of the diving suit. When we made eye contact, I was plunged again into a memory. This time, I found myself kneeling at my dad's graveside as my mom sobbed beside me. It was the moment I had known I would lose my mom as well, one of the most painful days of my life. Again, I felt a hand on my shoulder, but this time I looked down, saw the human leather glove, and closed my eyes tight. I felt the creature turn me around, could feel its face inches from mine, but I refused to open my eyes. I could feel its rage radiating out from it as the hands moved from my shoulders to my sternum and began tearing my chest cavity open. The fingers sank into the soft skin and tissue between my breasts, biting through the meat of my flesh and wrapping around my bones. I could feel my ribcage bending and instinctively opened my eyes as I screamed. I was instantly plunged into another memory, this one from the time I had dealt with a stalker in college. But this time I was ready, and as soon as I felt the creature's hand on my shoulder, I bolted. I ran through the hallways of my old college until it faced into the green and gray of the cemetery my parents were buried in. I forced myself not to falter as I ran past my crying mother, the creature still shambling after me. The cemetery faded until it was replaced by the hospital, and I continued to run, despite the burn in my chest and arms. I reminded myself it was a dream, a hallucination, but the terror remained. After what felt like years, the hallway faded into black, and I woke up. When I woke, I was in a regular hospital bed. Marnie was in the bed next to me, the curtain between us pulled back. Her face looked drawn and tired, older than I remembered. I took a moment to get my bearings, then pressed the call button for a nurse. A nurse wearing light purple scrubs walked in and lifted her eyebrows in surprise when she saw me. She said, "Oh my God, you're awake. This is incredible. Let me call your doctor." She rushed over and did something on the computer next to me, took my vitals, then ran from the room. She entered a few minutes later with a doctor in tow. They fussed over me for a while and gave me a little information, but I got the real story from Captain Cameron when he arrived. Captain Cameron, or Nate as he told me to call him, told me what had happened. He said that Jacob and I had just managed to pin the creature when I had fallen to my knees and begun sobbing. Jacob carried me back to the submarine and put me in the isolation chamber. When they opened it, I was there and catatonic, but Jacob wasn't. They weren't sure exactly what happened to him. They think he got grabbed by the creature, or maybe it was starting to get free and he ran back to stop it. Either way, Jacob had sacrificed his life to save mine. They hadn't been able to recover him. As soon as the creature was securely trapped, The storm had calmed, and what was left of the crew had taken the submarine back to the surface. It was a hard journey. Apparently the storm had been a rough one, and on a skeleton crew, it was extra hard. Apparently by the time we had gotten the creature off the ship, a total of 41 crewmates had been affected by it. Those of us who had been affected by the creature were taken to the hospital, and according to Nate, only a few of us woke up. I was among the first group to wake up, and even now, almost 6 years later, 8 of those people are still catatonic. I take responsibility for every single one of them. Marnie woke up eventually, and even though she said she didn't blame me for what happened, I was still removed from her team. That's okay. I'm not as interested in the ocean as I used to be. It turns out, the ocean hides some secrets for a reason.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.